Zalika was born into a prosperous family, surrounded by wealth and privilege. Her father was a respected merchant, known for his success in trade, and their home was filled with the finest fabrics, jewelry, and foods. However, her mother had passed away when she was a child, leaving her in the care of her father and later her stepmother. Her stepmother, a woman driven by greed and jealousy, never accepted Zalika as her own. She resented the girl's beauty, intelligence, and kindness, seeing her as a threat to the future she envisioned for her own children. Over time, she manipulated Zalika's father, whispering lies and planting seeds of doubt about his daughter's worth. Eventually, he grew distant, and Zalika found herself increasingly isolated in her own home. One day, without warning, her stepmother arranged for her to be married to Jengo, a poor but hard-working man from a distant village. Zalika had no say in the matter. Her father, under the influence of his wife, agreed to the marriage without hesitation. The decision was final. On the day of her departure, Zalika stood before the grand gates of her childhood home, her heart heavy with sorrow. She looked at the silk dresses she once wore, now replaced by a simple cloth wrapped around her shoulders. The servants who once catered to her needs stood at a distance, whispering amongst themselves, their faces filled with pity. As she was led away to her new life, she cast one last glance at the world she was leaving behind. She had been raised in comfort, surrounded by the luxuries of a privileged life, but now she was stepping into the unknown. Though she accepted her fate, deep within her heart, a spark of hope remained. Hope that this was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something greater. The journey to Jengo's village was long and tiring. As they approached, Zalika saw small mud huts scattered across the dry land, children running barefoot, and women carrying heavy pots of water on their heads. It was a world so different from the one she had known. No grand houses, no fine fabrics, no servants waiting at her call. Instead, there was dust, sweat, and the simple rhythm of village life. Jengo led her to his home, a tiny mud hut with a thatched roof, barely large enough for 2 people. Inside, there was only a small wooden bed, a few clay pots, and a mat on the floor. Zalika looked around, struggling to hide her discomfort. This was her new life. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she woke to the sound of village women preparing for the day. Jengo gently explained that she had to fetch water from the well, something she had never done before. As she walked through the village with an empty pot, she felt the eyes of the other women on her. They whispered, smirked, and shook their heads. "She won't last a week," one muttered. "A spoiled girl like her, she'll run back to her father," another scoffed. Determined to prove them wrong, Zalika followed the women to the well. She watched as they filled their pots with ease, balancing them gracefully on their heads. When her turn came, she struggled to lift the heavy pot, water spilling down her arms. Laughter erupted around her, but she clenched her jaw and kept going. Days turned into weeks, and each day brought new challenges. She learned to cook with what little they had, making meals from grains and vegetables instead of the rich dishes she once enjoyed. She worked in the fields alongside Jengo, her hands growing calloused from the rough work. At night, exhaustion overtook her, but she refused to complain. Through it all, Jengo remained patient and kind. He never mocked her struggles or made her feel small. Instead, he encouraged her, teaching her with gentle hands and warm words. "You are stronger than you think," he told her one evening as they sat outside under the moonlight. "You just don't know it yet." Despite the hardships, Zalika began to see the beauty in the simple life. The way the villagers came together to help one another, the joy in children's laughter, the comfort of Jengo's unwavering support. She was no longer the daughter of a rich merchant, she was the wife of a poor man. And for the first time, she wondered if wealth had truly ever mattered at all. As the months passed, Zalika grew accustomed to the rhythm of village life. The once unfamiliar tasks, fetching water, Cooking with little, working the fields, became second nature to her. The women who had once mocked her now watched with curiosity as she carried heavy loads without complaint and tended to the crops alongside Jengo. Slowly, the village began to accept her, though many still saw her as an outsider. One day, while gathering firewood, she noticed a group of women sitting under a tree, weaving baskets. Their hands worked skillfully, but their conversation was filled with worry. They spoke of debts, of not having enough food, of their husbands spending what little they earned on drinks instead of their families. Zalika listened silently, her heart growing heavy. That evening, she sat by the fire with Jengo. "The women work so hard," she said, "but they have no control over their own lives." Jengo sighed. "It has always been this way. They depend on what little their husbands provide." Zalika thought back to her own childhood, where she had seen her father conducting business, handling money, making decisions. Why should these women not have the same opportunities? She realized she had knowledge they did not. She had learned to read, to count, to manage trade from watching her father. Perhaps she could use what she knew to help them. The next day, she approached the women under the tree. "What if I taught you a few things?" she asked hesitantly. "How to keep track of money, how to bargain at the market, how to weave designs that sell for higher prices." The women exchanged glances. Some were skeptical, but others were intrigued. Slowly, a few of them agreed to listen. Zalika started with small lessons: how to save a portion of their earnings, how to recognize fair prices, how to plan for the future. Word spread, and soon more women joined her lessons. One evening, an elderly widow named Mama Zuena came to Zalika in tears. Her late husband had left her a small plot of land, but the village landlord had demanded an unfair tax, knowing she had no one to protect her. He threatened to take her land if she did not pay. Zalika felt anger rise in her chest. The landlord had no right to do this, yet he used his power to exploit the weak. It was unfair. The next day, Zalika accompanied Mama Zuena to confront the landlord. The other women of the village followed, standing together in silent support. Zalika spoke with confidence, using the knowledge she had learned from her father's business dealings. She pointed out that the landlord had no legal claim to the land, and that forcing a widow to pay unfair taxes was unjust. Her words held weight, and the landlord, caught off guard by the unexpected resistance, begrudgingly backed down. For the first time, the women of the village saw that they did not have to remain silent. They could stand up for themselves. That night, as Zalika sat by Jengo's side, he looked at her with admiration. "You are not just surviving here," he said softly. "You are changing things." For the first time, Zalika felt the fire of purpose ignite within her. She was no longer just a rich merchant's daughter or a poor man's wife. She was something more, and she was only just beginning. As Zalika settled further into village life, she began to see its struggles with clearer eyes. Poverty was not just a lack of money, it was a cycle, trapping generation after generation. Families barely had enough food to eat, children ran barefoot and sick, and women worked endlessly, yet remained powerless. The village had no doctor, no proper sanitation, and worst of all, no school. One morning, as she walked through the village, she saw a small boy crouched near a stream, drinking murky water. His mother, carrying a heavy bundle of firewood, barely noticed him. Zalika hurried over. "This water is not safe," she said gently. The boy looked up at her with confusion. She turned to his mother. "Do you know that dirty water can make him sick?" The woman sighed. "We have no choice. The well is far, and we do what we must to survive." Zalika's heart ached. In her old life, clean water was a simple expectation. Here, it was a luxury. She noticed other problems too. Many children never learned to read or write because they spent their days helping their families. Girls, in particular, were married off young, expected to work rather than study. Without education, they remained trapped in the same hardships as their mothers. Determined to find solutions, Zalika sought knowledge wherever she could. She spoke to the village elders, who told her stories of how things had once been better. She listened to travelers who passed through, learning how other villages managed their struggles. Jengo, always supportive, found old books in town and brought them to her. At night, by the dim light of an oil lamp, she pored over pages, absorbing everything she could about health, farming, and education. As she read, an idea took root in her mind. If knowledge had given her power, then surely it could do the same for others. One evening, she turned to Jengo. "I want to start a school." He looked at her, surprised but not doubtful. "A school? For the children, for the women. If they learn to read, to count, to understand their rights, they will have choices. They will have power." Jengo smiled. "Then we will find a way." The next day, Zalika stood before a group of women under the old tree where she had once taught them to save money. "I want to teach more," she said. "I want to teach our children to read, to write, to dream of a future beyond survival." The women listened, their expressions wary yet hopeful. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, spoke. "But how? We have no books, no classrooms." Zalika looked around. "We have this tree. We have our voices. We will start here." And so, her first school began. Beneath the shade of an old tree, with nothing but words and a determination to change the future. Word of Zalika's school spread quickly through the village. At first, only a few children and women came to learn beneath the old tree, tracing letters in the dirt as Zalika patiently guided them. But as the days passed, more arrived, curious, hesitant, but eager. Mothers brought their daughters, young boys begged to stay after their chores, and even a few elderly women sat at the edges, listening quietly. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, as Zalika was teaching a group of children how to write their names, a deep voice interrupted. "This is nonsense." She turned to see one of the village elders, a respected man named Bwana Kofi, standing with his arms crossed. Behind him, several other elders murmured in agreement. "A woman's place is in the home," he continued. "Girls should learn to cook, to serve their husbands, not waste time with books." Some of the mothers, who had been attending Zalika's lessons, lowered their heads, afraid to be seen defying tradition. Another man scoffed. "What good will reading do for a woman? Will it put food on her table? Will it fetch her water?" Zalika took a steady breath, keeping her voice calm. Education gives them choices. It helps them understand the world. A mother who can read can protect her children from sickness, can count her earnings at the market, can build a better future. The elders were unmoved. "This is not our way," one said firmly before walking away. That night, Zalika sat outside their hut, staring at the dark sky. Jengo sat beside her, his warmth a comfort. "They won't listen," she whispered. "They see me as a threat." Jengo took her hand. "Change is never easy, but you have already planted the seeds." The next challenge came not from the village men, but from someone she had long tried to forget, her stepmother. One afternoon, a group of women whispered excitedly near the well. Zalika approached, and they fell silent. "What is it?" she asked. One of them hesitated before speaking. "A traveler from your father's town passed through. He brought news." Zalika's chest tightened. "Your stepmother has heard of your school," the woman continued. "She says you have disgraced your family, that you are wasting your time on foolish dreams." Zalika swallowed hard. It should not have hurt. She had expected nothing else from her stepmother, but the words stung all the same. That evening, she found her resolve shaken. If the village resisted her, if her own family mocked her, was she truly doing the right thing? The next morning, she walked to the old tree and found disaster waiting. The wooden planks she had used as benches were gone. The lessons she had written in the dirt had been trampled. Someone had tried to erase her work. A few children stood nearby. eyes wide with fear. One little girl tugged at Zalika's skirt. "They said you have to stop," she whispered. Zalika's hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding. She looked up to find Jengo watching her. He said nothing, but his gaze was steady, full of quiet encouragement. She inhaled deeply and turned to the children. "Sit down," she said firmly. "We will start again." If they thought they could break her spirit, they were wrong. This was only the beginning. At first, Zalika's school remained small. The children came eagerly, tracing letters in the dirt with sticks, their faces lighting up when they recognized a word. A handful of women joined them, sitting at the edges, pretending to just watch. But slowly, they too began to learn. One evening, after the men had gone to the fields, a group of women approached Zalika in secret. One of them, a young mother named Amina, looked around nervously before whispering, "We want to learn too." Zalika smiled. "Then let's begin." In hushed lessons by firelight, she taught them more than just reading. She shared what she had learned about hygiene, about keeping water clean, about saving money. She explained how understanding numbers could help them avoid being cheated at the market. Slowly, these women gained confidence, seeing themselves as more than just wives and mothers. The first real breakthrough came when a young girl named Nia, no older than 12, approached Zalika with a request. "I want to write a letter," she said shyly. "A letter?" Zalika asked, surprised. Nia nodded. "My brother was taken to work in the city. My mother cries for him every night, but she cannot send him a message. No one here can write." Zalika's heart swelled with emotion. Together, she helped Nia form the words, guiding her small hands as they carefully shaped each letter. The next day, Nia's mother held the letter in trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought I'd see his name written," she whispered. Word spread quickly. If a young girl could send a message beyond the village, what else could Zalika's school accomplish? The resistance did not vanish overnight, but the whispers of doubt began to change. Women who once stayed away now came closer, curious. Fathers who scoffed at education saw their sons proudly reading aloud. Even the elders, who had once dismissed Zalika, grew quieter in their opposition. One day, Bwana Kofi, the same elder who had tried to shut her down, stood at the edge of the gathering, watching in silence. Jengo noticed and leaned toward Zalika. "They're starting to see," he murmured. Zalika nodded. She had started with nothing but words and determination. Now, the village was beginning to listen, and this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Zalika's school, once dismissed as a foolish dream, had begun to change the village in ways no one had expected. The women who had learned basic arithmetic now confidently counted their earnings at the market, ensuring they were never cheated. Mothers who once feared speaking up now made decisions for their households. The children who had once played aimlessly were now eager to learn, their eyes filled with the hope of something greater. One morning, Amina, one of Zalika's first students, approached her with a small bag of woven baskets. "I sold these in the market," she said, a proud smile on her face. "I made enough to buy extra grain for my children." Zalika beamed. "That's wonderful, Amina." But Amina's smile faded. "The traders from the big town pay us very little for our goods. They say village women should be grateful for whatever they get." Zalika frowned. She had heard similar complaints from other women. It was time to change that. That evening, she gathered the women together. "We must set our own prices," she said firmly. "If they refuse to pay fairly, we will sell elsewhere." The idea of demanding fairness was new, and some women hesitated. "But they have always controlled the market," one murmured. Zalika met their uncertain gazes. "Then we take control of our own future." The next market day, the women stood together, refusing to sell their goods for unfair prices. When one trader tried to intimidate them, Amina stepped forward. "We know our worth," she said, her voice steady. "If you don't pay fairly, we will sell to others." The trader scoffed, but seeing their unity, finally agreed to pay more. The women left the market victorious. Soon, other changes followed. With the extra income, families could afford better food, medicine, and even small improvements to their homes. The village, once struggling, began to thrive. Then came the unexpected visitors. One afternoon, as Zalika taught her students beneath the old tree, a group of strangers arrived, a small group of girls and their mothers from a neighboring village. A woman stepped forward hesitantly. "We heard of your school. Our daughters, they want to learn." Zalika's heart swelled. She had dreamed of this moment, but seeing it happen was overwhelming. "Of course," she said, smiling. "They are welcome here." That evening, as she watched the new students settle in, Jengo placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've started something bigger than just a school." Zalika nodded, determination burning in her eyes. "This is only the beginning." The sky remained cloudless for weeks. The river that once shimmered under the sun had shrunk to a narrow, muddy stream. Crops withered, and the once bustling marketplace became eerily quiet. The drought had arrived, and with it came hunger, desperation, and fear. Zalika watched helplessly as families rationed their food, eating smaller and smaller portions each day. Children grew weaker, their laughter fading into silence. Mothers clutched their empty baskets, hoping for a miracle. Then, the whispers began. "This never happened before she started changing our ways. She angered the ancestors by teaching women things they should not know. Maybe we should have never let her stay." Zalika's heart ached, but she could not stop. She worked tirelessly, helping wherever she could, sharing whatever food she had, guiding the women on how to make the most of what little they had. But the resistance grew stronger. Then, the worst happened. Jengo collapsed one evening, his forehead burning with fever. He had been overworking himself, walking miles in search of food, trying to keep their people hopeful. Now, he lay weak, his breathing shallow. Zalika ran to the healer's hut, but the old woman shook her head. "I have no medicine left," she said grimly. There was only one person in the region who had access to medicine, the last person Zalika wanted to face, her stepmother. Swallowing her pride, Zalika made the journey back to her father's town. When she arrived, she barely recognized the place. The home she had once lived in had grown larger, decorated with luxuries her father had never been able to afford before. She found her stepmother seated under a shaded canopy, dressed in fine fabrics, her face smug as she listened to Zalika's plea. "You need my help?" Her stepmother's voice dripped with mockery. "After all these years, you finally come crawling back." "It's not for me," Zalika said, keeping her voice steady. "Jengo is sick. People are starving. I know you can spare some medicine, some grain." Her stepmother sighed dramatically, inspecting her fingernails. "And why would I waste my resources on you?" Zalika clenched her fists. "Because it's the right thing to do." Her stepmother laughed. "You always were foolish." She leaned forward, her voice cold. "You chose poverty. You chose to live among those who have nothing. Now, suffer with them." Zalika left with nothing but a hollow ache in her chest. When she returned to the village, she was met with devastation. Smoke filled the air. People stood in silence, their faces pale with shock. Her school was gone. The wooden structure had been burned to the ground, reduced to blackened ashes. Books, precious books that had been gathered with such effort, were destroyed. The place that had once been filled with laughter and hope was now nothing but ruins. Zalika fell to her knees, her fingers digging into the scorched earth. "They did this," an old woman whispered. "The ones who feared your teachings. They want things to stay the same." Tears burned in Zalika's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She looked at the people around her, the students, the mothers, the men who had slowly begun to believe. This was the biggest blow yet, but she would not let it be the end. Zalika rose to her feet, her voice steady. We rebuild. The ashes of the school still smouldered, but Zalika refused to let despair take root. She had lost everything, her books, her lessons, the safe space she had built. But she had not lost her purpose. The village gathered around her, their faces weary and uncertain. The destruction had shaken them. Some still whispered that this was a punishment for challenging tradition. Others mourned, believing their chance at change had died with the school. Zalika took a deep breath and faced them. They burned the school, she said, her voice unwavering. But they did not burn our knowledge. They did not burn our spirit. Amina stepped forward, her hands still covered in soot. What do we do? We rebuild, Zalika said firmly. Stronger than before. The first days were the hardest. The villagers had little to give, but each contributed what they could: pieces of wood, bricks, labor. Even those who had once doubted Zalika began to help, realizing that the fire had not destroyed her resolve. But Zalika knew that rebuilding alone was not enough. The drought had left the land barren. People were still starving. She needed knowledge, real solutions that could help her people survive. So she made a bold decision. I need to leave the village, she told Jengo, who was slowly recovering. I have to find answers, ways to grow food even when there is no rain, ways to bring clean water, ways to make sure no one has to beg for help again. Jengo took her hands, his grip weak but steady. Then go. And come back stronger. Zalika set off for the nearest city, a place she had never been before. The journey was long, and when she arrived, she was overwhelmed by the towering buildings, the endless noise, and the people who hurried past without a glance. But she reminded herself why she was there. She found a small community of scholars and traders who worked on sustainable farming. She learned about drought-resistant crops, rainwater harvesting, and simple but effective irrigation systems. She spent hours studying how women in other villages had built businesses through microfinance, small loans that helped them start their own trades. She spoke to doctors about better health practices and found experts who could teach about clean water and sanitation. Each lesson was a key, unlocking new possibilities for her village. Finally, after weeks of learning, she returned. This time, not just with ideas, but with people. A soil expert who could teach them how to farm even in dry seasons. A healer who understood the importance of nutrition and basic medicine. A woman who had built an entire trade network for rural communities. When the villagers saw Zalika return, not alone, but with a group of people ready to help, they realized something powerful. She was not just a teacher. She was a leader. And this time, they would not just rebuild, they would rise. The village that once struggled under the weight of poverty and drought was transforming before everyone's eyes. Zalika stood in the center of the village square, demonstrating a new farming technique she had learned, a method of planting in small, water-efficient basins to conserve moisture. The farmers, many of whom had doubted her, watched skeptically at first. But when the first sprouts pushed through the dry earth, their hesitation turned to belief. With the help of the soil expert she had brought back, they planted drought-resistant crops like millet and sorghum. They built simple rainwater collection systems, ensuring that even in the driest seasons, they would have water. Within months, fields that had once been barren were turning green. The first harvest was small, but it was a victory. But Zalika knew that true change meant empowering the women too. She gathered the women of the village under the shade of a large baobab tree. We have learned skills. We have started to earn, she said. But we are still at the mercy of the market traders. It's time we take control of our own future. Thus, the Women's Cooperative was born. Each woman contributed a small portion of her earnings, creating a shared fund that allowed them to invest in better tools, materials, and supplies. They worked together, forming small businesses, selling woven baskets, handmade soaps, dried fruits, and textiles. And for the first time, they set their own prices. At the marketplace, Traders who had once dictated unfair prices were now faced with a united front of women who refused to be exploited. With their collective power, they negotiated better deals and found buyers from nearby towns who valued their goods. As word spread, women from other villages began visiting, eager to learn from Zalika. They took her teachings back to their own homes, sparking a quiet revolution. Soon, entire villages were adopting her methods, growing stronger, wealthier, and more independent. Zalika's name traveled beyond her village. Regional leaders and traders came to see the changes for themselves. Journalists arrived, writing about the woman who transformed her village. One day, a group of village elders, men who had once dismissed her as a foolish girl, approached her. "We were wrong," one of them admitted, his voice heavy with humility. "You have done what we never imagined possible. We need your advice." Zalika smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding. Change had come, and it was only the beginning. The transformation of Zalika's village had reached far beyond its borders. What began as a small effort to educate women and improve farming had now become a movement. Stories of her success spread, eventually catching the attention of a government official who specialized in rural development. One afternoon, as Zalika was overseeing the expansion of the marketplace, a messenger arrived. "The regional governor wishes to meet you," he announced. The entire village buzzed with excitement. A government official meant resources, real support that could help them grow even further. When Zalika met the governor, he was impressed. "You have done in a few years what many programs have failed to achieve," he said. "We want to fund your efforts, expand your work to other villages, teach them what you have done here." It was the opportunity she had been waiting for, but not everyone celebrated her success. News of her recognition reached her stepmother, who had once dismissed Zalika's struggle as a foolish mistake. Sensing an opportunity for personal gain, she arrived in the village, dressed in expensive fabrics, smiling as if she had always been supportive. "My stepdaughter could not have done this without the values I instilled in her," she declared in front of the officials. "It was I who taught her strength and discipline." The villagers, who had once feared speaking against her, now stood their ground. Amina, one of Zalika's first students, stepped forward. "You abandoned her, you mocked her, and yet she built all of this." One by one, others spoke up, defending Zalika's journey, making it clear who had truly led the change. Her stepmother, embarrassed, left in silence. Soon after, another message arrived, one that surprised even Zalika. She was invited to speak at a national conference on women's rights and rural development. Leaders from across the country would be there, discussing policies and programs that could shape the future of villages like hers. Jengo, now fully recovered and standing proudly by her side, encouraged her to go. "Your voice is powerful, Zalika. Use it." At the conference, she stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people, officials, activists, scholars. She shared the struggles of her village, the resistance she faced, and the solutions they had found. She spoke about the power of women, about how educating and empowering them could change entire communities. The audience erupted in applause, but in the shadows, not everyone was pleased. Some powerful landowners and officials, who had long benefited from keeping villages like hers weak and dependent, saw her as a threat. If more villages followed Zalika's path, they would lose control. That night, a warning came. A note left outside her door. "Stop now, or suffer the consequences." Zalika stared at the words, her heart pounding. She had come too far to be silenced. She knew the final test had come, and she would not back down. Zalika read the warning note again, the words meant to instill fear. But instead of retreating, she felt a deep resolve settle within her. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to turn back now. The next day, she stepped onto the stage at the conference hall, facing an audience filled with politicians, scholars, activists, and community leaders. The threats still lingered in her mind, but she knew this was her moment. She took a deep breath and began. For too long, we have accepted poverty as fate. We have believed that women are powerless, that villages like mine are destined to struggle forever. But I stand before you as proof that this is not true. The hall fell silent. My village was once a place where women had no voice, where children had no future, where hunger was a daily reality. But when we chose to believe in change, when we fought for education, for independence, for dignity, everything changed. She spoke about the power of education, how it had transformed her village. She described the women's cooperative, the new farming methods, the businesses that had grown from nothing. She told them about the resistance, the fire, the threats, and how the people had risen despite it all. We are not asking for pity. We are not asking for handouts, she declared. We are asking for a future where every village has the chance to grow, where every woman has the right to learn, where no one is forced to accept suffering as their destiny. The audience erupted in applause, but Zalika knew this was just the beginning. She returned home to find her village waiting for her. They had heard of her speech, of the movement she had sparked. They greeted her as a hero, not just their leader, but a symbol of what was possible. Jengo stood at the front of the crowd, his eyes filled with pride. He took her hands in his. "You have changed everything," he said. "Not just for our village, but for so many others." And it was true. Inspired by Zalika's story, villages across the country began adopting her methods. Women started their own cooperatives, built schools, and challenged traditions that held them back. Leaders took notice, policies began to shift, and change rippled far beyond what she had imagined. Years later, as Zalika stood before a new generation of young girls, she shared the lesson that had guided her through every struggle. Change begins with one person, one step, one dream. If you believe in something, fight for it, even when they say it's impossible, even when they try to stop you. She smiled at the eager faces before her, knowing that the seeds of change had been planted in them too. Her journey had started in struggle, but her legacy would last for generations.